So a lot of people are talking about Rich Swann becoming the Impact World Champion at Bound for Glory a couple of weeks ago. Rich Swann became the World Champion at Bound for Glory. Of course, this was the first time in his career that he's held a World Championship of any kind, but specifically the Impact World Championship. Swann defeated Eric Young in the main event of Bound for Glory a couple of weekends ago, and once again defeated Eric Young on Impact Wrestling last week to open the show in an impromptu World Championship match. So, who could be the next challengers in Impact Wrestling for Rich Swann's Impact World Championship? Let's go through a few names that could potentially challenge Rich Swann in the future. Now, the first name I think is probably the most likely name to challenge Rich Swann going forward for that Impact World Championship, and that man is Moose. Now, Moose is still carrying around the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. Now, Bound for Glory, Moose did defeat, I guess, maybe, EC3 at Bound for Glory. Now, I question that because I really don't know what that match was against EC3 at Bound for Glory. I really don't know what that match was. Now, if you didn't see it, it was a cinematic match. They labeled it and billed it as coming from an undisclosed location. It looked to be the warehouse that EC3 has done a lot of his Control Your Narrative promos, and to be honest, the storyline between Moose and EC3 was all about psychological mind games. It was all about being a little bit off the wall and a little bit different. It was a cinematic match in an undisclosed location, but it really just didn't do it for me. It really didn't do it for me. I felt like on several occasions during it, they were trying to be too clever, trying to be too niche and too subtle, and it just didn't work for me at all. And it's not the case that I don't like cinematic matches, because I do. I think the cinematic matches, some of them anyway we've seen this year, have been very good, but because we've seen so many, I think the standard and the bar is very high and the novelty has worn off a bit of them. So there does have to be substantial quality when it comes to these cinematic matchups, and it just didn't work for me. It didn't work for me. Like I said, I felt like they were trying to be too clever, trying to be too niche, trying to be too arty in their storytelling, and it just didn't work. But coming out of it, I guess, is that Moose gets a victory. I guess you would call it a victory over EC3. We don't know the status when it comes to EC3 and Impact Wrestling now. That's another subject for another time. But certainly Moose has a lot of momentum now. Now, last week on Impact Wrestling, he attacked Willie Mack in the parking lot. He sort of set up. Willie Mack was doing a selfie with a fan, and then Moose attacked Willie Mack. And of course, Willie Mack is Rich Swann's best friend. Saw Willie Mack get involved with Eric Young during Rich Swann's feud with Eric Young. So certainly, if Moose wants to make an impact, he would attack Rich Swann's best friend, and that being Willie Mack. And also, in addition to that, Moose did confront Rich Swann backstage when Swann was with the Rascals on Impact Wrestling last week. So I think it's very, very likely that Moose will be the next challenger, or the overarching challenger anyway, for the Impact World Championship. And I actually pitched something like this a long time ago. Now, it was with different figures at the time and different wrestlers in mind. But I feel like eventually we're going to get a TNA World Heavyweight Champion versus Impact Wrestling World Champion unification match. And I think that will be the natural end of the TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline. And I must say, if you're familiar with this channel, you're familiar with any of these videos, you'll know that I have really, really enjoyed the TNA World Heavyweight Championship story that's been involved in Impact Wrestling. I enjoy the nostalgia. Obviously, I'm a fan of TNA and Impact Wrestling in the past, regardless of if it was good or bad at the time. I like the nostalgia of it, and it's been great to see the championship, and I do think that Moose has benefited from holding the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. It has helped elevate the wrestler. I really do think so. I think Moose has stepped up his work. I think his in-ring performance has got better. I think his promos have improved to a point. I think there is still quite a bit of improvement there to be had when it comes to Moose's promos, but I do think they have improved. I do think some of his trash talking, shall we say, in his match against EC3 at Bound for Glory, I think he was meant to come off as very intimidating and all of this story during his match against EC3, and to be honest, I just found it quite hilarious. I didn't find it intimidating in the slightest. But I think he has improved, and I think the TNA World Heavyweight Championship has been a part of that, and I think he's done a very good job with that whole TNA World title storyline. But of course, all storylines, they have to end at some point, and I thought at certain points, to be honest, during his feud with EC3 and his story with EC3, I thought at certain points the TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline had ended, especially when EC3 sort of stole the championship. But apparently not, because Moose still has it in possession and he's still referring to himself as the TNA World Heavyweight Champion. But I think this is where it will end. I think this is where the TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline will end, and that is in a unification match with Rich Swann. I think we get to a situation where it's Rich Swann facing Moose in a winner-take-all scenario for the Impact and TNA World Heavyweight Championship. So I think Moose is the likely overarching opponent for Rich Swann next. We could have one in the middle, which we'll go to in a second, but I think it's very likely that we get Rich Swann versus Moose at the Hard to Kill pay-per-view in January 2021. But what about Eric Young? Now, I mentioned that the previous champion was Eric Young, and Rich Swann has been feuding with Eric Young for a long, long time now. The Eric Young versus Rich Swann storyline looks to be over now, to be honest. And it probably makes sense. The two men have been feuding since Slammiversary in July. They then had their match at Bound for Glory, which was the main event, and they had their follow-up impromptu match last week on Impact on Access TV. So I do think it's unlikely that their feud will continue. It looks to be done now, but I think you do have to consider, given the bad blood that there is between Rich Swann and Eric Young, we could have another potential World Championship rematch on the line here and on the books. Especially when you consider that there is an event, a show, prior to the Hard to Kill pay-per-view in January. There is Impact Turning Point happening in November in a couple of weeks' time. So I wouldn't rule out a potential Eric Young versus Rich Swann 3. And I wouldn't rule that out happening at Turning Point, considering that would genuinely be the bookend for this feud. It would be the final chapter in the Rich Swann versus Eric Young storyline. I think it's likely we could see some form of a gimmick match. Given the bad blood, I think you could see a like of a last man standing. I would say I Quit, but we've seen a lot of I Quit matches recently, not in Impact, but in various promotions. So I could see something like a last man standing, a bitter way to end this feud. So potentially we could see Eric Young and Rich Swann happen at Turning Point in a couple of weeks. This then allows Rich Swann to once again get the victory and then move on to possibly facing Moose at the Hard to Kill pay-per-view in January. So I wouldn't rule that out from happening in a couple of weeks' time. But what other opponents could Rich Swann possibly face in the future, maybe before Moose or maybe after Moose? One of those names I think could be considered is Ace Austin. Now, Ace Austin has recently been involved in a feud with the Good Brothers, the North, and the Motor City Machine Guns. At Bound for Glory, he faced all three teams in an unsuccessful effort. He's been partnering with Madman Fulton in recent months as part of this tag team feud, but you do have to remember that Ace Austin was involved in the Impact World Championship picture heading into Slammiversary back in July. Now, at that time, during that whole World Championship picture around July in Slammiversary, there was a lot of discussion that if Ace Austin won the match at Slammiversary, he would become the youngest Impact World Champion in the company's 18-year history. Now, there is still time to do that, but there is time running out on achieving that record. I think at this point, if I work out the maths correctly, Ace Austin has about 6 months, maybe 9 months to win the championship and set that record. And to be honest, Impact Wrestling, from a company point of view, probably really does want Ace Austin to set that record going forward. Now, why does Impact want that? Well, because the person and wrestler who holds the record as the youngest Impact World Champion in Impact history is none other than Tessa Blanchard. And we know how the relationship between Tessa Blanchard and Impact Wrestling ended. Impact wanted Tessa to come in and drop the World Championship at Slammiversary. She lives in Mexico with her, I think now husband Daga. She didn't want to travel or refused to travel. She refused to do promos and vignettes as well. Her contract was expiring anyway, so Impact decided, you know what, enough's enough. They fire her. They wanted to possibly re-sign or at least use Daga, her husband/fiance. I'm not sure the status of that right now. I think it's husband now. They wanted to use Daga at Slammiversary and possibly going forward, but obviously he's not going to work with the company that's just fired his partner, so he wanted out of the company. That didn't work either, and he was released a couple of weeks ago. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, that the way that ended, that relationship ended between Impact and Tessa wasn't great. And on top of that, obviously, you have the accusations and previous history when it comes to Tessa Blanchard. And regardless of all of that, regardless of the baggage that came with Tessa Blanchard and the baggage of making Tessa Blanchard the first ever world champion in not only the company's history, but the first ever female world champion in a male category, Impact backed her anyway. And then only a few months after that, she's gone from the company with a black cloud over her head. So the relationship there isn't the best. It didn't end on the best terms, and I don't think Impact is wanting to make people forget about their history. I think, if anything, they're proud that they backed a woman to become a world champion and was the first major company to do so. But we've seen with WWE before in the past, if someone holds a record, a major record in the company, and then they leave the company, WWE or another company tries to not necessarily erase that, but have someone else break the record. Whether it's CM Punk and his WWE Championship record, the Chris Benoit Royal Rumble record, etc. So I think Impact will want to change that record and have someone beat that record. And the opportunity is there to have Ace Austin win the World Championship soon and change that record and become the youngest world champion in the company's history. So I do think we could see an Ace Austin versus Rich Swann feud for the World Championship soon, possibly after January, after that Rich Swann versus Moose feud at Hard to Kill. And of course you have to remember that Ace Austin was in the final two competitors during that Slammiversary main event for the World Championship before he was defeated by Eddie Edwards. So I also believe during that match, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Ace Austin was the one to eliminate Rich Swann too. Rich Swann obviously eliminated Eric Young. Eric Young attacked Rich Swann, but the person to get the pin, if I recall correctly, was indeed Ace Austin. So there is certainly history there. There is certainly a story to tell there. And I think the match would be pretty damn good too. Now, I mentioned there Eddie Edwards. Now, of course, Eddie Edwards won the Impact World Championship at Slammiversary. He then went on to have his weekly open challenges for the championship on Impact Wrestling, so he had multiple championship defenses, but he actually lost the World Championship after only a few weeks when he was defeated by the former Impact World Champion Eric Young. Now, Eddie Edwards did get his rematch against Eric Young at Victory Road, which he lost. So I suppose the argument there is, technically, does Eddie Edwards deserve a rematch for the Impact World Championship? The answer there would probably be no. He also lost his match against Ken Shamrock at Bound for Glory, so you could argue that maybe Ken Shamrock actually deserves a World Championship opportunity more than Eddie Edwards does. But going back to that match at Slammiversary, Edwards could argue that he won a World Championship match before with Rich Swann involved in it, so therefore why can't he do it again? Now, I don't think Rich Swann versus Eddie Edwards would be a pay-per-view match, but it is certainly something I could see Impact doing on Impact Wrestling on Access TV in the coming weeks. So keep an eye out, because I think potentially we could see a Rich Swann versus Eddie Edwards match coming soon for the World Championship. Now finally, who else could be a future challenger for Rich Swann for that Impact World Championship? What about none other than the TNA original himself, the Cowboy James Storm. Now James Storm returned to Impact Wrestling during the Call Your Shot Gauntlet Battle Royal. He joined the match, he spit beer in the face of AC Romero, kicked Larry D, net breaker on combination one and both. He was one of the final four men in that match with Heath, Rhino and Sami Callihan. He was eventually eliminated in the match by Sami Callihan, but the main takeaway is that he looked absolutely fantastic. And it was great to see him back in an Impact Wrestling ring. Now, of course, James Storm is still currently one half of the NWA World Tag Team Champions with Eli Drake, but how great was it to see James Storm back in an Impact Wrestling ring? These TNA originals just belong in this company. And he really has done it all with Impact. He's a former 7-time NWA World Tag Team Champion during his time with Impact Wrestling, former TNA King of the Mountain Champion, former TNA World Heavyweight Champion, former TNA World Tag Team Champion, 7-time TNA World Tag Team Champion. So he's won the Tag Team Championships during his time in Impact Wrestling 14 times. It's absolutely crazy. And you have to also think about the fascinating year that James Storm has had in 2020. He started off the year with the National Wrestling Alliance on NWA Power on YouTube, becomes one half of the NWA World Tag Team Champions. WWE then contacts him because they wanted him to make a Royal Rumble appearance, but it couldn't happen because he was working a show with NWA. Then the plan was for James Storm to make his WWE debut on Raw after WrestleMania. The contracts were signed, everything was ready to go. Paul Heyman was a big fan of his. He also James Storm already started to do his own physicals to ensure that he would pass WWE's testing. Paul Heyman, as I mentioned, was reportedly really, really high on him. Of course, he was the executive director of Monday Night Raw at the time. And then what happens, like with everything in 2020, the pandemic happens. Everything gets delayed, everything gets put on hold. He then last speaks to WWE in July. He hasn't heard from them since. The deal is obviously off and dead due to the pandemic, and also because, as I mentioned, Paul Heyman was the executive director of Raw, but now Paul Heyman has been removed from that position and is no longer in charge of the Raw creative. So He now makes this appearance with Impact Wrestling, and it was absolutely awesome to see him back. Now, as far as I'm aware, we didn't really get an update as to the status of James Storm coming out of Bound for Glory, so at the moment it looks like maybe a one-time deal, but it could be full-time, and I don't know. This one just feels more complex to me. His appearance at Bound for Glory, to me, felt like more than just a cameo. And James Storm doing a one-off appearance with a company he has so much history with just seems a bit bizarre to me. And I know people will say, well, he still has a contract with NWA. Yes, he still does have the ties with NWA, but they've been very, very open about talents during this pandemic. They've told talents to take outside bookings, and if they want their release, they'll get it. Eddie Kingston's a great example of this. I think it was reported today that Allysin Kay, her contract's expired with NWA as well. So it's certainly in the realm of possibility that James Storm could be coming back to Impact Wrestling, and I really hope he does. Impact Wrestling is James Storm's home. And the WWE situation, it sucks because I would have loved to see him get that opportunity that he hasn't got in his career. Yes, he had the chance in NXT, but there's a difference between NXT and being on the main roster. But I said this about Eric Young when he returned to Impact, and I'll say the same here. James Storm has spent the majority of his career in Impact Wrestling. There is so much history there. Impact has all of this tape and footage of seeing James Storm evolve throughout his career. Think of the promo packages that they could do on James Storm. Think of the stories that they could tell. And Rich Swann as the world champion, there's been a lot of discussion. Is Rich Swann ready for that spot? Is he good enough for that spot? And who is Impact Wrestling's true top babyface? And I've mentioned before that I don't think they have one. And I think James Storm can be that guy. Yes, he's maybe an older guy at this point. Yes, he has miles on the clock, but he can still go, and if anything, looks to be in the shape of his life right now. And he's a name. And so I hope there is more than just his cameo at Bound for Glory. And I think a feud between James Storm and Rich Swann would be money. And maybe you put the title on James Storm, but I think it would be the right call, even a couple of weeks into Rich Swann's championship reign. Now, I'm not saying after 2 weeks Rich Swann drops the title, but maybe after Rich Swann faces an Eric Young again, and then maybe a Moose, maybe an Ace Austin, then you can go to a Rich Swann versus James Storm feud, maybe at Slammiversary next year. It's certainly something to discuss. But of course, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on Rich Swann's future opponents and next opponents as Impact World Champion? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll be sure to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys and chatting about Impact Wrestling here on the channel. If you have enjoyed this video, be sure to smash a like on the like button. Really does help us out here on YouTube. Go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.